Abuse in nursing is a serious matter and people need to talk about it more than they do. So there are thousands of nurses that are abused per year and there are different ways that the abuse can happen. Very few tend to be reported, and when they are, they're not properly dealt with. And there are different studies and research that has been found about the abuse. So a few of the types are physical, which is hitting; mental, you can manipulate someone; emotional; and verbal, such as yelling. So again, very few are reported per year, and usually if they are reported, they're not dealt with properly or people don't really care that it happened. So I'm going to talk about three main points today, and the first one is how often per year it happens, and if it is reported or how to report it. Then I'm going to talk about different studies that I've found and different research that intrigued me into talking about this topic. And the last one is personal stories that nurses have told and how it affected them overall and how over the years they have learned to cope with it. So back to point one, how often per year it is reported. So again, as I said many times before, thousands are abused per year. And that's the ones that are reported or that they tell someone. The ones that are not reported, there's no telling how many that there are. So it can happen behind closed doors and never told to anyone. So that could mean that if a nurse goes into a patient's room, she could be abused or yelled at, and she could never tell anyone, and that doesn't go along with the thousands that there are that have been reported. So there are different places that abuse can happen. There's the psychiatric ward, the emergency room, and a normal doctor's office. So in a psychiatric ward, that is where typically the mentally handicapped patients are, mentally disabled, such as people with OCD, bipolar disorder, or PTSD. And that's where the most abuse happens because those are the patients that are provoked the easiest and they feel like they have to stand up for themselves, so they feel like they have to hurt the person in front of them, and typically that tends to be a nurse. In the emergency room, people are very impatient and they feel like they should be put at the top of the list to be seen, but they don't realize that there's more going on behind the curtain. So they take out their anger on a nurse, and that can be just yelling at them or that can be physically trying to hurt them. And in a normal doctor's office, we can all relate that we're really ready to leave. We don't want to be there long, and we do feel like it's the nurses standing in our way, not being able to see the doctor, but in reality, it's just the doctor taking too long. On to point two is the research and the studies that I thought were very intriguing. So a couple of different studies that have been done are comparative studies and open-ended studies. So comparative studies could be comparing the different types of abuse, and open-ended studies are if a nurse tells her story or she offers advice to people, or a scientist or researcher takes many stories and compiles a paper out of them. So a lot of the studies relate around the same thing, what happened to them and how they coped with it. And it can also be the nurse's fault or the patient's fault. The nurse could provoke a patient in the wrong way that she should know that she shouldn't, or a patient could just be angry at a nurse for no reason and take out their anger. So there are close to 4,000 per year that are reported or are told to someone. Physical is of course the most, as you all probably thought. So nurses are more likely to be abused because of their frequent contact that they have with the patients. And a lot of people forget about the CNAs, and they're even more likely to be abused because they tend to be younger, and that makes them more vulnerable. And on to our last point is how the nurses cope with it and some warning signs that we should all look out for. So a couple of the warning signs are agitation, stress, being jittery in a chair or not being able to sit down, and pacing back and forth, and yelling, which yelling is considered verbal abuse, but yelling can lead to physical harm to someone. A lot of the nurses that I read about felt like they could have protected themselves better if they would have talked about the warning signs or mentioned it to someone around them and not one in the room by themselves. And they do sometimes feel responsible for the abuse because they felt like they could have changed things or not said a certain thing to a patient. So, in conclusion, workplace abuse for nurses is a very serious thing that a lot of people don't talk about. A lot of people don't realize that nurses put their lives at risk every day just going in to a patient's room. Some patients do tend to be dependable on nurses, so if a nurse says the wrong thing, then they feel like they have to protect themselves, and that means they'll do anything that they can. Nursing does have a huge reward, but at the same time, it does have a huge cost. Nurses do have to protect themselves a lot more than people think, and they do face danger every day in doing what they love.